and welcome again to Decoding the Gurus. It is the podcast where two academics, that is me, Matt Brown, and Christopher Kavanagh, listen to content from the greatest minds the online world has to offer. I'm a psychologist and we specialize in understanding the mysteries of the human brain. Chris is an anthropologist, and I'm not quite sure what anthropologists do, but I think they pursue primates through jungles or something. And we are going to do what we usually do, which is get to the bottom of the interesting stuff that comes across our feed in this interconnected online world culture. Are you ready to go, Chris?
I am. I'm just back from my latest expedition in the world-famous rainforests of Japan, trekking after the noted gorilla populations that exist here. So I'm back. I'm back from that, and ready to go.
Yeah, so I think your research method is you basically interfere with them and bother them as much as possible until they react and do something interesting. That's kind of how it works,
it's anthropology because I go and live with them for several years. I'm basically at one with the Japanese gorilla population now. They've accepted me into their troop. That's... I don't want to get into it, Matt, because it's a spiritual experience for me as much as a research topic.
Okay, so we are at episode 3, which I think is a pretty important milestone for us, eh, Chris?
That's right. The death knell for many fledgling podcasts, the Bermuda Triangle of episode 3. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we are flying through it with sailing colours.
Very good, very good. And the reason people listen to us, Matt, is for that kind of, nice analogy and beautiful turn of phrase, I think.
Yeah, you can tell I've studied for years in higher education. So the first thing we have to do today is issue a correction.
Yes.
I know this is going to disappoint many of our listeners, but we did get something not quite right in that last episode on James Lindsay.
That's right, and we were hoisted by our own petard because after lambasting James for his failure to research Jurassic Park canon in suitable depth, we spent a significant amount of time discussing monkey science fiction virus outbreak movies and speculating on what was being referenced. And we managed to cover a large amount of those movies, but the one that we didn't mention was Outbreak, which is the movie featuring Dustin Hoffman. So look at that. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. We deserve that feedback.
Yeah, we did. Okay, take this. This is our mea culpa. We humbly apologize and retract that.
Yeah, no, I'm going to just say, Matt, that the Jurassic Park one is still worse because it's a much more important movie than Outbreak. But
I think the broader point still stands, Chris.
It does. It persists unrelented. And so the other feedback that we got was we had two in detail kind of tweet threads breaking down the episode and giving some critical feedback by Skeptic Review, which is Gretchen, and Psych Lockwood, which is Patrick Lockwood, both people we follow on Twitter and interact with. And they had various feedback, but and it was very nice to see, I would say. But one of the criticisms they raised, which it would be interesting to hear, was that basically our view that the James Lindsay is overreacting to the critical theory and social justice threat. That our view that it isn't causing dramatic societal changes, or that really puts us in the academics with our head in the sand camp, the kind of people who historically when the Nazis were gaining in power were saying, no, don't worry about it, look at they're just a radical fringe that nobody's paying attention to. So what do you think, Matt? Do you think that's a fair criticism, or would you like to defend your take?
I think it is a fair criticism. I'm trying to figure out whether I agree or not. It's really hard to say, because I think this is actually a bigger point, which is it's really hard to tell the relative magnitude or scale of a particular problem, isn't it? Because you know, the news and the Twitter feeds and everything like that delivers this microcosm and puts things under a microscope, and it could well be symptomatic of a broader thing, or it could just be a flash in the pan. And that's true on whichever side of politics you kind of lie. I can think of many sort of left-wing kind of scares or paranoias, I suppose, which it's kind of, is it just a kind of a dramatic news event, or is it symptomatic of something much, much bigger? So I honestly don't know. I haven't figured that one out. Have you?
Yeah, I've got it nailed down. No, I similarly, I think that where I fall on this is that I'm not in the camp that says this is only a thing like the kind of critical justice or woke stuff is only a thing that applies on like specific campuses and has no impact on the real world. Like I don't think that extreme is true, because there are cultural impacts, and there are even just the mere rhetoric is clearly relevant in modern politics. But on the other hand, the part that I don't buy into is the kind of presentation by James and others that we are on the cusp of a woke totalitarian regime, right? Because the examples that they use are, that we have in the past have seen left-wing totalitarian regimes, which we have. But by and large, those have been communist regimes, not woke regimes. And this kind of image of I think that genuinely people are imagining re-education camps where you and I and others will be like lined up and made to recite D'Angelo until or tattoo anti-racist on our forehead, and like that seems to me a kind of far-fetched thing, which might be a result of having read too many young adult fiction novels about dystopian futures. That's a cynical sarcasm for quotient for this episode going up. So yeah.
Well, I agree with that. I mean, I think I said last week that one thing about the more woke culture is just how nicely it synchronizes with corporate culture. It's too big a topic to get into, but it doesn't strike me as revolutionary. Rather, it seems like very much a middle class cultural kind of thing, which is very comfortable with pretty much maintaining. This is the sort of socialistic side of me coming out, but it is very comfortable with maintaining the class system, Chris.
You are the revolutionary that we should be worried about, Matt. This is the third episode twist. Matt comes out as the societal revolutionary.
Well, I am unironically in favor of fully automated luxury gay communism. I'm putting my flag in the sand.
Oh God! Well, we'll have to have an intervention at some point after this episode, but I'll accept that. And as I've invoked this episode, Matt, maybe it would be interesting to mention who we're dealing with this week and what our new topic is.
Yes, I'm very glad to do that. Okay, so today, we are going to be talking about the big one, the big kahuna, the man, Jordan B. Peterson. It was just a matter of time before we got into JBP. I think we wanted to save him until we had a little bit of practice, until we were warmed up properly. So it's kind of exciting. It's like a landmark moment. It's a milestone, I think, in many ways.
Yeah, I think he's probably the least controversial person that we've dealt with to describe as a guru.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he's Yeah, he set out to be a guru, let's face it. And, maybe he is. We'll find out, won't we? So do you want to give a very brief summary of JBP for the 2 or 3 people who listen who don't know everything about him?
Yes. I want nothing more. So Jordan B. Peterson is a clinical psychologist, maybe personality psychologist as well, who until recently was based at Toronto University and basically had a career publishing away as a clinical psychologist with fairly decent, I think, in fact, very decent citations and maybe sort of influential in his field. He came to fame to the public and to myself more recently when he was involved with publicly opposing the introduction of a law in Canada that he presented as involving compelled speech about respecting people's pronouns. And this obviously mainly associated with trans rights or trans people requesting different pronouns. And he didn't actually object, or he clarified at various occasions that he didn't object to using an individual's preferred pronouns interpersonally or in his classes, but he did object to the government having a law which he interpreted as mandating that you respect someone's pronouns or face legal consequences. And from that, he was recorded debating some students at the campus, and that went viral. And prior to that event, he had been recording his lectures and putting them online. So had a not huge YouTube following. But in the wake of his growth with this viral video, people became aware of his online lectures, and those became popular. And then he gave some talks and eventually published a self-help book called 12 Rules for Life. And his fame continued to grow until he became a regular fixture on social and political topics, issuing his opinion, and many think pieces written about him and his potential connection to the alt-right or extreme right-wing communities online, and his objection to that connection being presented. So yeah, he became a controversial figure and issued a lot of content online in the form of lectures and interview series.
It's interesting, isn't it, how so many of these figures kind of make their path towards fame through one of these controversies that build up a storm, whether it's Brett Weinstein or JBP or even Donald Trump. It's by saying controversial things, sort of sparking a bit of the sort of culture war backlash that really, in many ways, propels them to popularity, hey?
Yeah, and actually, I've heard Brett Weinstein discuss in an interview that admission to the intellectual dark web, one characteristic or requirement might be to have undergone a public test of your commitment to free speech. So in essence, an initiation ritual where your ideals are tested in public and you stand up and reveal your true character. And as a cognitive anthropologist who, alongside chasing apes through the jungles, specializes in ritual psychology, and I've done some research on initiation rituals, it definitely seems to fit the bill to me that there is this group identification or social bonding with people perceived to have undergone a public ordeal that they then link to their commitment to free speech. So it becomes like attached to a secret value and an identity, be it the intellectual dark web or, some other group. So it's very interesting for me from that perspective of it being a kind of initiation ritual that someone needs to undergo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very. So today we're going to look at a clip, an interview. We've posted it on Twitter already, so if you haven't watched it by now, that's your problem. You really should have. Bad.
That's
You're banned.
Chastise the audience.
Okay, so this is an interview with about religion, Chris, I think.
Yeah. So content that we're looking at today is an interview he did on a YouTube channel called Transliminal, where it's actually another cognitive anthropologist from my neck of the woods. So he's probably also just back from his field trips with primates, interviewing Jordan Peterson in an extended 2.5 hour interview, mainly about his views relating to philosophy and religion and this kind of topics, not so much the culture war stuff, though that comes up at the end. And we kind of canvassed people online to ask for content to look at. And this was recommended by a couple of people as one of his more substantial and better pieces. So lots of his material is, the well-known stuff is confrontational interviews or his lecture series. But this is a kind of standalone episode. And I think it's actually a very good one for illustrating lots of the broader themes that are in his work or the way he presents himself. So it's a good chunk of material for us to look at in terms of, as a guru.
Yeah, and very challenging too. I mean, we'll get into this, but it is 2 hours long. Although we can't criticize him for length because we've been known to create long content. But it is challenging for me to understand precisely what he's arguing for and what he actually means. Although, and so I find it very interesting. Like if you look through the YouTube comments or you look at, I'm mutuals with many people who like and admire Jordan Peterson, and they haven't really cited this issue of finding him difficult to understand. They often say he's insightful and stimulating and all that stuff. So
I don't know. I do get, even from people that like him, they tend to acknowledge that he has a waffly way of talking. They appreciate that about him. So like I definitely have heard, even from people that are fans, that they find him at times impenetrable. but that feels like a feature.
Yeah, I think that's taken as evidence of what a high level he's operating on. So it does have that kind of guru-esque quality, but
I should also have mentioned that there's 2 interviews on Transliminal Media, and this is the second one from 2017. So this is kind of at the peak of Peterson's rise. And the interviewer, Jordan Levine, the cognitive anthropologist guy, it's actually quite interesting because he's very good in his questions at rephrasing things very coherently and concretely and asking quite specific questions. But he does so in a friendly way. So it's an interesting interview in that respect, just like from good interview technique.
Yeah, although Jordan is equally good at refusing to be pinned down.
So. Yeah, that's the contrast. That's what makes it like such an interesting contrast, because there's these very specific questions, and then the answer is never specific, or if it is, it comes after like 10 minutes of tangential discussion.
So the nominal topic is ideology, logos, and belief.
Yeah.
I had to Google. I should say also, I had to Google a lot of terms that we used in this. It probably would make a lot more sense for a theologian or theology scholar, I suppose, for whom this stuff might feel more natural. You're an anthropologist, so when you're not bothering primates, and you even study religion. So, like, do you think this made more sense to you than to me?
Well, that's impossible for me to answer, but I possibly so, because my background is like my personal background is that I was raised Catholic in a Catholic family in Ireland, and so the Christian components of it are not alien. And then I also had an interest in mysticism in like my kind of teens up to my early 20s, and still do like find that stuff kind of interesting. So I know a bit about Christian mysticism and the Sufism and various other traditions. So that gave me, like a foundation. But this is not to say that like there weren't times where I was like, what the hell are we talking about? Like, it's just that I think that foundation helped.
Yeah. Good. So yeah, let's get into the clips, shall we? And we'll take that as a bit of a this is a difficult ball of string to unravel because JBP is who he is. So I tried to make some kind of structure or plan to cover this stuff and kind of failed. But I think if we work through some of the clips, then we can take those as jumping off points to make some comments.
Yeah, and so one of the issues is that, like, in trying to extract clips from this, it's very hard to cut out a segment because he keeps linking things in or like wandering down tangents to his tangents that would require like splicing things together. So some of these clips might be long, but I'm just sharing with my frustration, where I was like, okay, I'll take a clip of this. Wait, stop talking, stop like going on about side tangents. Like, just can you say that again concisely? But that rarely happens. So
yeah. Look, I think a couple of longer clips is really helpful for listeners because in terms of to illustrate how he talks and how he argues, because it's all kind of the same, like it's the same style throughout. So I think a couple of longer clips we can afford the time, which will be really helpful to illustrate how it actually works.
Yeah, it's good. No one complains about the length of podcasts. So
no, they love it. They love it. They fall asleep to it.
Yeah. So with all that preamble, let me play the first clip, which probably will illustrate some of these long, winding connections. So here we go.
And I've been thinking about why that was, because many people have decried political correctness, but they did it in generic ways, and so here's a strange sequence of thoughts. So there's this idea in Christianity that the word, which is the capacity that's associated with consciousness, I would say, is the mechanism by which chaotic potential is transformed into habitable order, and also the mechanism by which order that has become too rigid is dissolved and reconstituted, right? That's the basic element of the hero myth. And the word, the logos, is a universally distributed eternal phenomena. But in the Christian context, it's also been given a localization. So it's as if this universal principle, well, that's the word made flesh, it's as if the universal principle was also instantiated in the local. And there's a deep idea there, which is that the universal lacks something. And what it lacks is specificity. So in order to make the universal even more universal, you make it specific.
So how was that to get us started?
Yeah, that's the kind of thing I struggle with, Chris. Okay, so
yeah, I think before even breaking down that, what he's actually trying to say, I would just say that's characteristic of his way of speaking and presenting ideas that, one thought leads to the next, and before you know it, he's moved from why he remained popular when there's many people decrying political correctness to discussing logos and the instantiation of logos in a embodied Christ figure and the uniqueness of Christianity. It does sort of follow a logical stream, but it really is connecting a lot of disparate things together into a thought stream.
It's so the reason I have trouble with it is that it is, as you say, very associative. A whole bunch of ideas linked together in this network of associations for one to kind of get the feeling of what is meant. So that's not rigorous, but I guess it's legitimate in that it's almost like poetry. I'm not sure how to describe it.
Yeah, I think, it is kind of theological reflection, a lot of it. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it's kind of surprising that he became so popular on the basis of this, because I can imagine some people saying, in a different era, I got a 15 cassette thing on how to pray properly by some Christian theologian, that not being regarded as a cool, edgy thing. but listening to Jordan Peterson discuss the Bible across like a 15 series online lecture is regarded as something that is not only interesting and worthwhile, but it's kind of like an edgy thing to do.
Yeah, kind of new and hip.
It's just surprising.
Yeah, it is. It is because, I mean, like I recognize, if I had to do a bit of research, but I recognize some of the substance behind this stuff. For instance, this instantiation of the universal in the specific, I figured out there's an element in Christian theology. It's one of their ways of thinking about the divinity and of Christ and so on. He's both a specific human being, but also representing these universal things and God and all that. So it's not like he's just making this stuff up, but like that's a topic that wouldn't seem to be either controversial or attractive to most modern people.
Yeah, and I think it's the linking of these grand narratives and large philosophical topics to very specific culture war issues, right? That might be the unique component. So there's a clip here of him talking about his origin story where he emerged from his opposition to this Bill C-16 in Canada. And I think this gives a good example of like how he links issues into broader meta-narratives.
I believe that that's an unwarranted intrusion of a certain kind of ideology. It's postmodern ideology fundamentally, with its roots in a kind of a surround of Marxist identity politics. And I think that it was completely inappropriate for that to be transformed into legislation.
So he argues that his opposition to that bill is a very incidental fact to his bigger philosophical opposition to postmodernism and neo-Marxists who are destroying everything. And he actually makes this point very clearly when he argues that he even sees the transgender people, which were in some sense seen as the target for that bill because it was about using appropriate pronouns for people, that his opposition to the bill is actually in defense of them from these philosophies that they are being sacrificed to. And again, Matt, I'll play a clip and then see what you think about that.
I do not believe that legislation like Bill C-16 is in the least in the interest of these people who are marginalized. Quite the contrary. I believe they're sacrificial victims to the onslaught of a continuing postmodern neo-Marxist ideology.
Yes, so he does characterize that this specific issue, which obviously became a big thing and played a big role in him developing a much larger profile, he characterizes it as an instantiation. This is his theme of, instantiating things in the specific, of what he sees as this sort of great battle between truth and order and the word and habitable orders versus, chaotic potentials and so on. So
I can hear from the tone of your voice, Matt, that you were really into this.
Yeah. So we'll talk about this later, but what comes through is his worldview, which it's amazingly anti-materialist in that he really believes very strongly in that there is a more true reality, like a kind of spiritual. He calls it theological, but he uses his own special definition of theological to mean I'm not sure what. But he sees this hidden reality underneath the material, and he says that the real stuff is happening there, and stuff like politics or economics or even society and so on is just kind of the ephemera at the top. So it is interesting. He's a spiritualist, so he's very much it's a very different worldview from yours or mine.
Yeah, this sort of surprised me. The way I came across Jordan Peterson was I listened to him on the Sam Harris show and I was aware, of him, the protests and the controversy surrounding him. Then I heard him interviewed by Sam Harris, and they had like a 2-hour endless debate about like truth. Right. And that Peterson was arguing for what many might consider the kind of postmodern view that, you know, truth is not about something corresponding to fact or reality. It's more about meaning, and like it's a long episode. You can go listen to it if you want.
No,
but,
I won't.
yeah. But after that, I then didn't pay that much attention to his content. You know, just in clips and the interviews and whatnot with him. And then I got the 12 Rules for Life long after it had exited the cultural moment and like people weren't paying attention. So I read it a year or two after that, and I was kind of amazed at how much theological, Christian-focused content there was in it. There was psychology, there was like self-help stuff, and there was some culture war thing. But like the much more dominating theme for me was like religious themes, connecting things to the Bible, and it surprised me that people didn't focus more on this aspect of him, at least that I saw.
Yeah. So it is interesting that both his, like, that's not the feature that is emphasized by either his fans or his detractors, because his fans would sort of characterize him as a rigorous, facts don't care about your feelings kind of guy, and his detractors characterize
some of his fans, because I think he has a wing that like him because of this, like the side that lean towards spirituality and maybe specifically Christian spirituality, and that if they've spent a lot of time with his material, it's impossible that they've not noticed this. So maybe the people that you're talking about, I'm not sure, but there might be, you know, different wings of his fandom. Yeah.
Well, he is there in the IDW and so on, you know. So he's kind of got that sort of associations. But like, I do agree with you though that I think one way to understand what JBP is about is part of a much bigger long-term trend, which is for religiosity, I guess, in the face of, you know, science kind of eating away at it and undercutting it over the last 100 years or more, has progressively become more and more abstract and, you know, to sort of and more philosophical and spiritual in a very vague, abstract kind of way. So it's much, unless you're an evangelical Christian in the American Midwest, then, you know, and if you are religious, you probably think about your religion much less in terms of concrete things about, you know, a bearded guy in the sky and about like the sort of literal truth of things that happen in the Bible, but much more in terms of how JBP describes it, which is like psychologizing it and making it more ineffable and you know, very vague, but also much more congruent with a sort of a scientific view of the world, because it's now operating in a completely different domain. Am I making any kind of sense, Chris?
Yeah. No, I'm just thinking that my image of popular religion, though, is that what you're describing does account for a lot of modern religious sentiment, particularly amongst people who are not connected to traditional religious communities. Or arrived at religion later at life. But I guess my pause is that I think there's a substantial portion, especially in America and North America, of religious people for whom their beliefs are fairly literal and biblically based or fundamentally based, at least, that there is a heaven, there are angels interacting in the world, and there's a literal devil and a hell, like not abstract philosophical versions of those, much more physical reality stuff. And that's where lots of the opposition for abortion and things come from, that community or that wing of the religious community.
Oh look, they absolutely certainly still exist and are a strong force. I guess my point is that characters like JBP appeal to both kinds. like as you know, as we see in this interview, he has it both ways. He gets asked directly about the literal truth of some Christian things, and he has it both ways, in which it's kind of congruent with whichever flavor of religion you prefer.
Yeah, I have a clip that speaks nicely to this, and also his issue with definitions. So let's start with this one.
Well, I would say the same problems with the question formulation obtain. What do you mean by divine? And also, what do you mean by Christ? These are very, very difficult questions.
So that was in response to a question asking him, does he literally believe in the divinity of Christ, for example? And the interviewer actually introduced that the evangelical people might like Jordan Peterson's stuff, but be curious, does he literally believe it? And so his answer is, well, first it depends how you define divine and how you define Christ. and this is a common thing, is retreating to, it's all about definitions. And the thing that strikes me about that is, like, on the one hand, okay, you want to get your definitions clear for what you're talking about, especially if it's a complex topic, but redefining well-known terms constantly and defining them in a vague way is supposed to be something that critical theorists and postmodern people do, and it's supposed to be bad, right? That, like, they redefine common words in the way that suits their purpose, or they argue that there is no agreed upon meanings, that they are happy using things in metaphorical ways. So it feels like there's at least one group of people that shouldn't be cheering on this way to respond to direct questions.
No, exactly, and it dovetails with that other theme of sort of having it both ways, where, Jesus Christ is both a literal figure who did do miracles and all this stuff, but also he's like a Jungian hero, archetype, and he's an archetype, and
he's not just a hero, he's a meta hero.
Yeah, exactly. And so you just left kind of
Matt, there's a perfect clip that relates to this. This is in response to the topic of hell coming up.
Right. People who believe in hell are terrified of hell for themselves, and in my estimation they should be, because I also believe in hell, although what that means, again, is subject to interpretation. Lots of people live in hell, and lots of people create it.
It's so beautiful, because he starts like he's actually making the point I made about, there are people who have literal beliefs in hell. It's a literal place. And then his response is to say, and I believe in hell. But then he realizes he's perhaps endorsed that sounds like he's endorsing the literal one. So he immediately goes, well, depends what you mean by hell. And then he starts talking about hell is other people, right? Or hell is, it's like, but then didn't you just, you believe in hell in the metaphorical sense, right? But not as a physical location. And I don't think he would answer that, he can't answer those things directly.
Yeah, no, I don't think he can. He's a psychologist, and he's obviously religious as well, although it's very unclear what kind of religion he has. But
except that it's Christian.
It is definitely Christian. Yeah, that he's very clear about that. So the interesting dynamic is him sort of transforming and melding psychological, or it's not contemporary psychology, it's the psychology that's associated with clinical stuff and quite old-fashioned stuff like Freud and Jung. But sort of melding this sort of psychological definitions of things like people creating their own hell, and with a religious conception of hell. And it's just so nebulous. I'm not really quite. I can't agree nor disagree with it, because I'm not sure what's being said.
Yeah, and this doesn't only apply, like this tendency to muddy the water and redefine things in unclear ways does not just apply to the religious content, because maybe in that sense you could be like, well, he's talking about concepts which are themselves vague and theological, so that you have to give some leeway to do that. But let me just play a clip of him talking about dominance hierarchies and how they, even though that's a topic that he talks about a lot, they aren't dominance hierarchies.
I use dominance hierarchy because that's a shorthand. People understand what that means. It's not clear that hierarchies are, in fact, dominance hierarchies.
So I mean, so he goes on to justify this because he's basically saying, they don't necessarily have to involve dominance, but it means that, even words that he invokes fairly consistently and which have well-known definitions, that you can't trust him because he might be using it just opportunistically. I say dominance hierarchies, but I don't actually mean dominance hierarchies. So it's impressive on the one hand.
Yeah, it is impressive, and it's difficult to comment on except to look at the rhetorical maneuvers he's undertaking.
Yeah, so I guess the point I want to make here, and it's something which actually applies across some of the other figures that we've looked at, less so James Lindsay, more so Eric and Brett Weinstein, that this use of strategic ambiguity, so that you can say something, but you can always retreat from it if you're pressed or if somebody tries to pin you down, by endorsing metaphorical and literal and alternative definitions, that you can make quite provocative statements, but then you can always say, well, yeah, but I wasn't talking about it in the way that you interpret. Whereas James Lindsay style cultural commentators or gurus are not doing that so much. What he thinks is relatively clear, right? He specifies out what he thinks about critical theory. So I think this use of strategic ambiguity is something that you see across a whole range of gurus, and it's really common in New Age type gurus, which aren't something that we've discussed or focusing on, but the parallels are clear.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's like, I guess it's like the Mott and Bailey technique on steroids, because it, as you say, it is really, really useful because it allows you to make quite striking and seemingly very forceful comments when people are implicitly reading the quite strong interpretation of the words you use. But then if there are internal consistencies that people point out, or there's pushback, or it becomes difficult to defend, you roll back to the very vague and nebulous definition of the thing. And then you can switch back, obviously, to the powerful one whenever you like. So it's this back and forth, which, JBP isn't the only one who does it. It's obviously very common, but he does do it a lot.
Yeah, and there were some striking examples in this. There was even an instance where Jordan Levine, the interviewer, essentially, I felt like he was giving him what's that, soft pitch, or what do you call that expression when somebody throws you an easy question? Softball, yeah, soft pitch. my baseball expertise is shining through there. So a softball question, because he asked him at one point about magic, and he basically said, because Jordan Peterson had talked about how when somebody comes to embody logos in its fullest form, that they can do things which are magical. And then the interviewer is like, well, wait, when you say magic, do you mean, magic that it looks to us hard to explain, and feats which seem incredible psychologically, or do you mean pulling rabbits out of a hat? And that felt to me like, okay, he's going to endorse the first one and say, obviously I don't mean that. But that's not what he said. So let me just play his response.
And when you say magical, you mean magical for all intents and purposes in terms of our perception as relatively naive human consciousness, or magical in rabbits out of hats?
Well, certainly the former. And God only knows about the latter. So, that takes us afield into strange areas. Like Jung's observations of synchronous events, for example. Yes. We don't understand the world. I do think the world is more like a musical masterpiece than it is like anything else. And things are oddly connected.
So he does, he means psychological magic or metaphorical magic, but literal magic, let's not rule that out. the Jungian archetypes about
Yeah,
that. You
and
know?
that goes to his worldview, which I got a better understanding of after listening to this, which, as I said before, is in believing sort of an underlying, he calls it theological, but he kind of means spiritual and matters of anything to do with morality and good versus evil and so on. He believes in that spiritual world underlying reality and influencing it in important ways. And I think that's the one thing that we can say definitively about JBP's point of view after listening to this.
Yeah, there's some segments where he starts to explain why rationalists and Sam Harris and Dawkins in particular are wrong, and that their belief or the fact that they use evolutionary theory and that evolutionary theory involves forces of selection means that they cannot be materialists and be consistent.
Right. And his argument there was that selection, the action of selection is not a material thing. Did I remember that right?
Yeah, hold on. Let's let the man say it in his own words.
The processes that make up social interactions among social animals can't be reduced to their material substrate, but they're real. And they're so real, they select. So they're real. And this is the problem I have with the people who are simultaneously reductionistic materialists and evolutionary biologists. It's like, sorry guys, you don't get to be both.
I think it's worth spending some time on this argument that he presents, because he presents it forcefully, as you can see there, but I find it really silly, like fundamentally silly, because if I'm trying to summarize it, essentially he's saying that selection is such a fundamental process in the world, and maybe he's even talking about evolutionary processes as they apply to the formation of planets or something like that, right?
No, I think he's talking about biological evolution. He's talking about.
Well, okay. I was going to let him give him, but he is focusing on biological evolution on the planet Earth. So yes, okay, but even taking that, you can abstract evolutionary processes out into mathematical formulas, for example, and there's no reason that you couldn't apply them in some respect to like different avenues. Dawkins has talked about this as well, right? I'm talking about processes of selection, not the specific process of evolution amongst biological things. So even if you accept that, the part which doesn't make sense is he's very upset about people acknowledging that and then trying to tie that to the material world. But as far as I'm aware, Matt, the only place that we've ever seen selective processes in action is the material world and reality, right? Like we don't have any evidence for selective processes in the spiritual metaphysical realm.
No, it is a very silly argument. You don't have to be a specialist evolutionary biologist to know that evolution is entirely based on the material. And, the fact that some selective processes in social animals like people may well involve things like communication and social relationships and so on. In Jordan's mind, that because those things are, in his mind, derived from theology, this spiritual realm, then you can't understand evolution without appreciating its basis in theology, which...
Yeah, I thought his objection, although this is probably illustrating the point that, you can interpret some abstract painting in so many different ways, and that's a lot of what he says. But I thought his issue was more that the interactions between animals or these like broader processes that they fall into, they don't relate to individuals' behavior. Like, so they can refer to species levels effects, or they can refer to processes that are only evident over generations. And that means looking at the like biophysical level is reducing things to where you can't observe those patterns.
Oh, right. Yeah, well, he might have been saying that. Who knows? I mean, but obviously your point is that emergent phenomena like and selection Yeah, and species evolution is like an emergent phenomena of just, lots of little interacting simple.
Yeah, but my point is it emerges in the physical world.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. I mean, that is obviously true, so...
Yeah, you can, even the books where we write down our ideas are on paper. So like there's this part where he nods to this argument, and it's quite interesting because he's basically saying, well, people will say, everything is tied to the material world. And he's pointing out that's a bad argument. So let me play him rebutting us.
Now you can say, well, it's associated with material phenomena. It's like, well, yes, I would like to point out that is hardly a brilliant observation. Everything is associated with the material world because here we are in this world.
Right. So this is like a tactic where you acknowledge a criticism, but you don't actually explain why it's wrong, right? And the other part that got me about this was he almost has insight. He's talking about like linking things to the material world. But when I heard him say that, it was like, it applies to his argument, right? You can link any two things together if you try. But is that valid? The more important question is how convincing are the links that you draw? But yeah, he's not making that point.
He's not making a good argument. I think we've explained it enough, but I'm pretty sure most people listening would appreciate that you can understand evolution without requiring a theological level of analysis.
Yeah, in that sense, like it's close to intelligent design, right? Is arguing that there's a mysterious process in evolution that you simply cannot explain as a materialist.
Yeah.
So a point which derives from this, which leads us on to his colorful metaphors, is that alongside seeing rationalists and materialists or Sam Harris types as being fundamentally wrong, he also takes issue with anybody who would credit the development of reason and democracy and the modern West to the Enlightenment. And there's this really nice quote where he explains why that's wrong, and it invokes a metaphor that he uses elsewhere. So let me just play that for you, Matt.
What we're talking about here is something that's indescribably deeper than merely what happened in the Enlightenment. I just see that in some sense, as a sideshow of this crystalline process that's emerging.
So what's the crystalline process?
That's the question.
Can you explain that?
I cannot explain that. So perhaps not surprisingly, JBP is not a fan of attributing good things to the Enlightenment or that general period of empirical or rationalist type of thought, because he likes attributing the good things to Christianity. And, there's some limited way in which that is true. Obviously, Christianity had a big influence on that part of the world, and, through the kinds of things that happened through the Reformation and so on, I'm sure there are all kinds of influences one could trace back. But I guess what he's trying to do is really cast this grand narrative, a grand Christian narrative, sweep of history in which pretty much anything good, and he likes the word logos a lot because that's kind of free speech, and in his mind it's also the word, but it's also consciousness, and it's also the sense of order and good generally. So he would see that expressed in the Enlightenment, if I'm understanding him right.
Wait, now I'm confused. So, okay, you're saying that the Enlightenment is just like an instantiation of a deeper philosophical force, right? The logos that's operating.
That's it. You're totally getting Jordan Peterson now, Chris. Yeah.
So this crystalline structure metaphor, I think is connected to that, right? Where he, in response to some, I remember it as like a fairly direct, straightforward back and forth between him and the interviewer. And then he just like comes out with, well, while you were talking about that, I was thinking about something. And I want to play it because it took me by surprise when I first heard it.
Well, when you asked that question, I had a vision, and the vision was of a plane of Earth, barren Earth, with a gigantic crystalline structure underneath, forcing itself upward and breaking up the dirt. And that's exactly how I would answer that question. It's that there's this great idea attempting to manifest itself. Like it manifested itself, for example, in the decimation of slavery, right? Because there was an idea, and the idea was, well, all men are created equal. That's the idea. And that's idea is rooted in a much deeper idea, which is that there's a spark of divinity in everyone. And that's this logos capacity that enables people to name things and give form to the world, and that we're not to violate that. And that emerged, you could say, well, that emerged tremendously slowly, but didn't emerge slowly at all, man. The idea is only, in its thoroughly formulated sense, the idea is only about 2,000 years old. It emerged with incredible rapidity.
So that is one hell of a metaphor. But I mean, I'm just gonna the thing that struck me as I was listening to that was that when I hear Jordan Peterson giving credit to white European Christianity for destroying slavery, I can hear a million critical race theorists crying out in pain.
Yeah, that they may have played a small role in that throughout history as well, right? Yeah, and there is a point where the interviewer brings that up and asks him how does he defend Christian atrocities. And you might imagine that he responds to that and gives a clear answer, but I don't think I even have where he answered, because there isn't a straightforward response. There's winding paths. So I can't even remember what his answer to that was. No. Do you have any idea?
No, I don't think he really answered it. I think he just went off on several tangents of tangents.
Oh, sorry. Actually, I've just realized that what we just listened to.
That was his answer to that.
That was the answer.
Yeah.
So that was the initial answer, was that question was posed, and when he was asked about that, he imagined a giant crystal. I think that's quite telling, right? And then he goes on to the Enlightenment and how, that isn't actually the answer. So yeah. So does that answer the question correctly about like why we shouldn't also, attribute to Christianity, say, the divine rule of kings or the civilizing mission?
So, no, it's just the good stuff, Chris, that we attribute to Christianity. Yeah, no, I mean, the more I think about this, the more it strikes me what a poor fit JVP is with the IDW, because he, all of the stereotypical things that people attribute to the IDW, he really is not on board with them.
Yeah, I think he's an outlier in a bunch of respects, unless you include in IDW the conservative Christian wing, like Ben Shapiro and stuff. I think he shares more in certain respects with their worldview than people like Dawkins and Harris.
Although even the Christian ones don't really emphasize it as part of their sort of worldview. I think, I think WP is a little bit unique in the way that everything is kind of linked to Christianity.
Yeah, and so another aspect of the worldview that it does relate to his interest in Christianity, and which struck me repeatedly through this and also through the 12 Rules for Life, is that his characterization of what is the fundamental element of existence and being is remarkably bleak. Like he's got a focus on the side of humanity which is, life is suffering and humans are depraved and dark creatures. And like he does acknowledge positive aspects, like even in that we should still, fight for the light or that kind of thing. But like he spends a lot more time in detailing the fundamental nature of pain, and that pain is the characteristic of existence. Did you notice this?
So, I think you got a clip there with Descartes, and he sort of starts talking about Descartes, and you think he's going to talk about consciousness being, I can perceive things and I'm aware of things, and therefore, that's kind of a starting point. But it's not, is it? It's suffering. Suffering is the starting point.
Yeah, let's play it and we'll go from there.
Descartes' great investigation into doubt led him to the conclusion that I think, therefore I am. And I don't think by think he meant think the way we think. He meant more like the fact that I'm consciously aware is something that I cannot deny. That's good. That's fine. And you know, more power to Descartes for taking it to that extreme and then producing what he did produce out of that. But I don't. For me, when I investigated the structure of doubt, the conclusion that I drew was that there is nothing more real than suffering.
Yeah. So whereas Descartes may say, "I think, therefore I am," for Jordan Peterson, it's I suffer.
Yeah.
Therefore,
Yeah, and later on, he emphasizes that happiness is more about, in terms of how people act and behave, it's more about avoiding suffering rather than approaching and pursuing happiness. And he's quite explicit about that.
Yeah, as we can hear here.
Because they're not differentiating. Like, there's the positive emotion end of being happy, and there's the not suffering end of being happy. And what people mean when they say that they want to be happy is that they don't want to be suffering.
Yeah. So it's the cessation of negative emotions, not joy. And I will say there's validity to that point. When you're measuring affective response in psychology, you measure positive effect and negative effect. And you can decrease negative effect without increasing positive effect, right? So they're separate concepts, sure. But it's his kind of relentless focus that when people say they want to be happy, what they really mean is like they don't want pain and suffering and fatigue and negative feelings. I'm kind of like, is that true? Like, are people really, not talking about, they want to enjoy life and have pleasurable moments and that kind of thing? And the amount that he fixates on this, that this says more about him than necessarily the human condition.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to escape the suspicion that this is the philosophy of someone who has had a problem with opiates.
or would go
on to. Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that just personally he is someone who suffers from angst and sublimates that in various ways perhaps. But sorry, Chris, I find it hard to say something cogent about that.
No, I think you did. I think the point that like somebody who would become addicted to painkillers would think that the fundamental element of existence is pain. And this is the core motivating factor, right? That seems relevant.
Yeah. So look, I mean, this is more just an observation, more of a criticism or anything. But I guess, I mean, I think one of the interesting points that comes out of this talk is very much that he has quite a bleak outlook, as you said. It's quite dark, and he talks about the role of evil in people's lives, the evil that they inflict on themselves, but he also emphasizes that, coming into contact with evil people really, and that this is the cause of many issues. So, I'm not saying he's right or wrong about that, but it just, the general picture is a very bleak one.
Yeah, and the link at the previous point that we were making, he talks about the issue of suffering and its fundamental nature to philosophers as opposed to materialists. And let me just play.
From the perspective of the materialist, there's nothing more real than the atom, let's say. Okay, from the perspective of a philosopher of being, alternatively, there's nothing more real than suffering.
Right, like that puts it in quite stark contrast. And I think you're feeling that like we shouldn't, that we're not attacking him for his personal focus on pain. I think the element of criticism comes from the fact that he's not describing this as just like his personal philosophy or view. He is instead attributing it to philosophers worldwide and to humanity writ large. That's the issue. It's making subjective assessments and connections and portraying them as obviously true, fundamentally correct facts.
Yeah, like a broad consensus among every philosopher who's thought about it. And, there's certainly themes in philosophy, whether it's existentialists or Stoics or whomever, who do emphasize pain and suffering. Yeah, so, like it's not out there. It's just an important, theme and flavor to JBP's way of thinking.
Yeah, and so just before we get off the pain, the pain, there's an aspect where he is discussing, like a lot of his pain comes up when he is talking about being and what he means by being, and how this is a more fundamental force in the world than the kind of materialist one. And listen to the way he describes pain from this perspective.
People's actions indicate that they believe in their own pain. And that's undeniable. You can't argue yourself out of it. So it transcends rationality. And so it's real. It's an axiomatic tenet of religious systems, generally speaking, that life is suffering, which is a restatement of exactly the same thing. And so being is the domain in which pain announces itself as real. And that's not the material world. It's not the material world. Pain is not a material phenomena.
Right. So the part for me where the argument breaks down is again that pain outside of human subjective experiences, or or at least like some physical experience for some conscious being, it doesn't make sense, because there isn't a fundamental force floating through the universe that's like, pain. Like maybe in the Marvel conception of the universe, there is a character that does that. But in the world as we know it, that fundamental element of existence is like a subjective experience of conscious beings. And he seems to regard it more as like a Platonic ideal, which transcends rationality, transcends the material realm.
Yeah.
But like,
yeah, look,
how?
I mean, yeah, look, obviously
Right.
the issue that we're talking about is dualism, where JBP is coming at it from this sort of Platonic, dualistic, whatever. We're not philosophers, so we're not going to pretend to be, but where these mental states and consciousness is a real thing in the same way that atoms are real, and perhaps more real because that's the stuff that we actually experience. Whereas sciencey, materialisty type people who aren't philosophers of mind like you and I say, hey, these are just emergent phenomena that arise out of the physical world. Now, you and I aren't going to we don't want to deal with the issue of dualism in this podcast, but yeah, it's just worth noting that JBP is definitely of the brand that treats these philosophical, theological, and spiritual things as having a real basis in reality.
Yeah, and I think the issue that I'm going to take is, so while there are many people in this audience, including himself, who are very upset with postmodern scholars for their denial of objective reality and their tendency to engage in obscurantism and play games with definitions, all of the things that we're talking about fall into that category. And there was this part where he's asked a question, and to answer it, again, it's like the crystal structure thing. He begins by saying, well, let's think about the spiritual essence of a lemon. And like, when I heard it, I was like, why do I have to go down this tortured route thinking about the essence of a lemon and how it reveals the lack of a dichotomy between spirituality and reality? And like, does it, does thinking about a lemon do that? So again, I think hearing the clip itself might help, might help the audience understand the persuasiveness of this point.
The concept of material reality is a post-Enlightenment concept. I mean, if you look, for example, at how the alchemists described things prior to the emergence of the material world, they discuss the nature of the essence of the lemon. Well, a lemon is solar in essence. It partakes of the sun. Well, it needs the sun. It's yellow like the sun. It has the same stuff as the sun. The sun is golden. The sun is mercurial. The sun is illuminating. Like, it has all sorts of attributes that we would consider spiritual. There was no distinction between the spiritual and the material.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, all right. Okay. Look, I'm going to talk JVP's corner here for a moment, and
okay,
let's say he's merely being descriptive. All right. He's describing how alchemists and so on in the pre-scientific era approached things. And lemons, for instance, that's nothing wrong. You got to get past the lemon. So, okay, that's valid. Of course, there's a lot of magical thinking was kind of interwoven with natural philosophy for many hundreds of years. But is he saying they were right? Like, that's
the issue. I'm fine with you describing, alchemists and what they previously imagined as the sympathetic magic kind of things, right? Like a lemon is yellow and the sun looks kind of yellow, so they're connected. And it's a plant, so we know that it does derive, like all this stuff. That's fine. But isn't he saying they were right?
Yeah, I think so. I think he's saying that the truths arrived at through, obviously religion is a pretty scientific concept, and to a large degree a way of understanding the world, I suppose. Why do events happen? Why do bad things happen to good people, and so on? Why has God angry with us? Yeah, he has a lot of respect for the pre-scientific, for want of a better phrase, view of the world.
So to me, that sounds remarkably familiar for respect for other ways of knowing, which is supposed to be a boogeyman that the postmodernists are trying to sneak in.
I totally agree with that point. I mean, critical theory and social justice has been famously described as a religion, as if that's a very bad thing. But yeah, JVP for one is all for religion and all for a religious way of constructing meaning out of the world. So yeah, it's perfectly at home with the social constructionists and postmodernists generally.
Yeah, and there's a part later where the interviewer tries to get him to characterize the difference between himself and postmodern, because this critique has been raised before of his work.
There's a bunch of rules of the game, and this is why the postmodernists, by the way, are wrong about the infinity of interpretations. They're wrong. There is an infinity of potential interpretations, but there isn't an infinity of viable interpretations, and that's the issue. That's the critical issue. So what constrains the range of interpretations? Well, let's say there's an infinite number of ways of construing the world. Well, there are. And that's again the postmodernist take, right? It's not only can you interpret texts an infinite number of ways, but the world is a text and it can be interpreted in a number of ways. And so you can't define any particular mode of interpretation as canonical. That's the fundamental claim. Okay, let's take that apart. Wrong.
And he argues that the distinction between himself and the postmodernists is that his realm of possible interpretations or meanings or whatever is constrained by the fact that he recognizes the forces of biological reality and evolution and that kind of thing. But as we've already seen, his commitment to a hardcore empirical evolutionary framework is relatively, the grasp is not firm. So I don't know. And I also don't think that the argument of postmodern philosophers, who, again, I claim no expertise over, but I don't think their argument is like there is absolutely no interpretation that is wrong.
No, of course. That's a bit of a straw man. I mean, but where it's congruent with JBP is that they perhaps would emphasize the social construction of meaning and saying that overlaying the material reality, that the way things are perceived and the way it's negotiated socially is of great importance, And there's obviously some truth to that, but you can't criticize them for that and also be a fan of JBP, basically, I think.
Yeah, and be consistent, at least. There's definitely overlap in those perspectives, and him simply saying that his reasoning is more constrained, it feels like a relatively weak argument.
It's pretty weak, given that he sees that the theological reality gives rise, that evolution has to encompass that theological reality. So it's not much of a concession to say that he takes into account the capital S science of evolutionary biology when he sees that is itself strongly based on theological stuff.
Yeah, and so to take it to bigger themes, I think it's reasonable to because if you sit back and just consume the talk, I think we both experienced this. If you don't question the connections being drawn and you can just follow along. In some sense, it's kind of convincing and compelling because you just get this narrative story almost about how the world works, how all these things are connected. And even if individual parts give you pause, it does come together in a coherent narrative. And I think that's part of the appeal that he offers, and which many of the gurus that we look at offer. You're being inducted into this select group of people who can see these hidden connecting structures which apply across culture, across religion, across time, and are like so fundamental. So yeah, you might be talking about transgender people getting into the bathrooms, but actually it's connected to the eternal battle between the forces of good and evil.
Yeah. So he really does provide these, and in his words, maps of meaning. It's not really it's not a logical or an analytical thing that he's doing. It's a network of associations and feelings. So I described it as poetry early on because I think that's why people like it, and I think that's the mode in which he is communicating. So that initial clip which we played where he explained political correctness in terms of the word and consciousness and chaotic potentials, and which creates habitable orders but also dissolves habitable orders, and the hero, like it's just a scattergun of associations, which if you sit back and let it wash over you is quite sort of pleasant to listen to. Like I find JBP annoying when I try to understand exactly what he's saying and what his argument is. But if I don't try to do that, if I just sit back and listen to it as if it's like art of some kind, then I could certainly see the appeal, because it does give, it's very vague, but it definitely gives kind of a sense of meaning. Like it gives a grand narrative without actually, and when you're doing that kind of thing, it's actually a negative to be specific. I can understand why he doesn't want to be pinned down, because it's not about being pinned down and being specific. It's about providing the flavor.
Yeah. So like you say, staying away from the specifics is a good idea. And if you're going to do specifics, you should make it into a narrative which is compelling. So a really good example of this, a clear one, and one I want to bring up, is when he's discussing how compelling and mysterious Christian iconography is. So here's him discussing Christian iconography and its complexity.
The reason for that is it's too complicated for us to articulate. So it's bottom up. It's bottom up development. It's like the iconography of Christianity is an attempt to express something that we're not yet smart enough to understand.
So we're not yet smart enough to understand Christian iconography. And this relates to a story he tells where he went to an art museum and he spent some time setting this up in New York, where there was a bunch of pictures from the Renaissance era, but people were coming to see a particular picture of Mary and Jesus. And this is the end of that story.
And there were a lot of people standing in front of the painting looking at it. And I thought, well, let's be a cultural anthropologist about this. All right. That museum is on some of the most expensive real estate in the world. There's a tremendous amount of time and effort spent on producing the museum and fortifying it and guarding it. And then people from all over the world make pilgrimages to stand in front of it. And what they are looking at, they do not understand. So what the hell are they doing there? Why are they looking at those pictures? Well, the answer is the pictures speak to their soul, but not in the language that they understand.
Yeah. Okay. So Chris, I'll go first. So that sounds compelling to me. I've got this image of people coming and marveling at these ancient mystical objects, and clearly, why would they go to all that trouble and spend so much time and effort to put themselves in their presence and be entranced by these objects? They're clearly speaking to them, I think, on some kind, and communicating to them on some kind of ineffable spiritual level. That seems right to me.
Yeah, doesn't it? So let me make a counter argument to that point and see if we can spitball it. So when I lived in London, there was an art museum which is quite well known called the Tate Modern. In that art museum, there is modern art, as the name might suggest. And I have a feeling that there are a lot of people coming from various places around the world to look at modern art, including things like, well, Jordan Peterson might be interested in this, but like Andy Warhol's lobster phone, right? And setting aside the deep truth that lobsters communicate to us spiritually, there's plenty of art in there that I doubt that Jordan Peterson or others would regard as speaking deeply to the soul. There's things which are like a shade of blue or abstract objects arranged in unusual shapes. So fixating on like people come to look at a Christian painting, and that gives us some important insight about how deep Christian iconography is. Like,
yeah,
does
exactly.
it?
Yeah, so that's the thing. Jordan's analogies and argument sounds good. You know, it feels right when you listen to it, as long as you don't think about it too carefully, which is, I think that's the mistake you made there, Chris.
I have an entire folder from this episode which is just called questionable claims, and it's full of things like this. But people might say, well, you're fixating on like a small detail in his grander narrative, but his grander narrative is just made up of a collection of like these smaller details, and this is the evidence that is used to support the bigger connections. So that's an issue. Yeah, that's right. I mean, we don't have time to go through every single metaphor and every single chain of reasoning, but the ones we've looked at are pretty representative of all of them, I think. And yeah, they're pretty weak. Like, they don't really. I mean, yes, you can put these things together and use it as the raw material with which to create a sweeping narrative. And as a work of art or poetry, I think that's perfectly fine. But it shouldn't be taken as any kind of rational argument or analytical argument. It's an associative argument of feeling. So yeah, I think that's a fair criticism. Yeah, and okay, since you're not going to let me go through all the questions, well, one by one. I want two of the superstars from that category to mention. One is that the sentiment which people attach to furniture, so like you've got a favorite chair or whatever, that is a more fundamental and important thing to understand about a chair than its material reality.
And you can dissociate the object itself from the, let's call it the subjective overlay. But that's not such an easy thing to do, and it's not so self-evident, and it's not even obvious that what you're doing when you do that is coming up with a more accurate picture of reality.
Right. So he this is again him kind of saying like there's an ineffable element of existence, and the sentiments that are attached to objects may be more important than the object's physical reality, right? Now, when you make that kind of argument, my brain immediately goes like, important to who? Or on what basis do you judge that? Because sure, in regards to like individual people who have connections with the chair, there is memories attached to that and emotions attached to it. But it isn't true to say that that's a fundamentally deeper truth about the chair than the fact it's made from wood, right? It just depends on your question or what you're asking, but they take the chair out of that context and just give it to someone who doesn't have all those connections, and that's not a deeper reality of the chair that's like carried along with it.
It's a reality that's in your head. And as a psychologist, it's kind of surprising that JPP doesn't emphasize that.
Yeah. And that's unobjectionable to say like a person has a, psychological connection to an object, which can be fundamentally more important than the object. But that isn't what he says. That's only the Mott and Bailey argument. And there's another illustration where he's talking about a pro footballer. And it's a short clip, so I'll just play it for you.
It's like the life of a pro football player. Is that real life or is that a game? Well, at some point, the game is life. Right. And so then the question is, well, what should the game be? And Piaget's answer was, well, the game should be one that everyone agrees to play.
Okay, so that's part of a bigger conversation related to like rituals and rules and the way that they are a microcosm of society. But the point I want to make in highlighting that analogy is this thing about, is a professional footballer playing a game or living life? That relies on like this kind of metaphorical trick or linguistic trick that a footballer's livelihood is derived from playing a game.
Yeah.
But he's using it to make a point that games and life are in some ways like kind of interconnected and hard to distinguish. But that specific example is just relies on the fact that, you know, somebody who plays a game professionally earns their livelihood from a game. It feels like a cheap trick of an argument. Because, like, obviously a pro footballer is playing a game and they get paid to play the game. That's like, there isn't a mystery there.
No. Yeah.
Sorry,
I know what you mean. It's the linguistic tricks, like playing on double meanings of words like game, and using that to support an argument, which is it's a stretch of an argument, and you can't. It's just to support it using pretty weak tools like that is not very good.
Yeah, and okay, so look, we've went down a bunch of negative roads, and we've probably deeply offended all the Peterson fans in our audience. So maybe we should shift tack, at least for a minute, just to say about some of the reasonable or semi-reasonable stuff he says, or any of the things that you find. I have some ideas, but maybe you have your own.
I did have some positive things, and I've kind of forgotten them after our long diatribes.
Okay, maybe I can get you started. So one of the things that I thought he does do well is that when he's talking about psychology, he's at one point arguing about the problems with our measurement instruments for when we talk about well-being. He kind of goes into a methodological critique of the psychological measures of well-being and how they're imprecise, and how our measurement instruments are basically not up to scratch when it comes to psychological science to make extreme statements.
That's a big problem for someone who wants to do scientific measurement. It's like, okay, we're going to increase well-being. Hey, no problem. How are you going to measure it? And whose well-being? And mine? Okay, mine now, mine next week, mine next month, mine in a year. How about 10 years? How about 50?
And who chooses how to measure it?
Well, precisely. And my well-being in relationship to my significant other, in relationship to my family, in relationship to the community, at all those levels of temporal distinction, you're going to measure that, eh? Good luck.
And I thought that, and some of the other parts where he talks about psychology, are good and accurate and like important points. And similarly, when he's criticizing Sam Harris for having like a worldview and a set of suppositions which he doesn't acknowledge as being important to arrive at his conclusions, that all seems reasonable.
The facts themselves cannot tell you that. And that's why you have an a priori interpretive structure, which is, of course, what Kant was insisting upon. And Sam doesn't take that into account, and that's mind-boggling to me, because that a priori interpretive structure is the sum total of the effect of our evolutionary history. So, like, what about that?
So, I mean, I just wanted to highlight that he clearly does have, expertise, including in psychology, and he can make well-argued, coherent points. Like, it is possible.
Yeah, it is possible. I think if he's talking about some specific or technical thing, then he's well able to string an argument together. I think it's more that the subject of his attention is so big and broad and so all-encompassing with the theory of life stuff that I think he just overreaches terribly. So I think if I was to sort of turn it around and try to defend him a little bit and almost qualify a lot of our criticisms, is that, you know, in his emphasis on the subjective and subjective experience and meaning and so on, I dispute the terms like theological and casting things in terms of good and evil and so on. But in terms of that subjectivity, as a clinical psychologist and as someone who writes self-help books, you know, in many ways it's very right and natural for him to have that obsessive concern with that non-material aspects of life, you know. So that's not controversial or particularly bad in as far as it goes. Yeah. Would you agree with that, Chris?
Yeah. I like, in terms of, if you regard him as a theologically inclined self-help guru, I think it becomes a lot more tolerable. The issue is that he's also simultaneously treated as an empirical psychologist who's very science and evidence orientated, and those two hats don't sit neatly together. There's a torture metaphor.
You know, that's right. That's right. And so the feedback I get from people who like JBP, I don't think that they're reading him or listening to him and taking the stuff as like literal truth or literal facts about the world. I think most of the time, I think they tend to take it as stimulating things to think about. So I suspect that many people who like his work are not maybe taking his words at such face value or taking them as seriously as we are. Like we're taking what he's saying, what he's arguing for, and saying, does that stack up? Does that actually make sense? Have you considered alternative explanations? Is it actually supported by the examples and metaphors that you're giving? And it's usually not. But if you take it as kind of inspirational poetry or self-help, now that's a much lower bar. And if it's a bit like the modern art you were talking about, the lobster on the telephone or a big blue square, you know, if it speaks to you, then you know, that all's well and good.
Yeah. Well, like another point that I think people would probably bring up if they've watched it is that towards the end of the interview, he does acknowledge quite openly his possibility to be mistaken and that he's really thinking out loud.
Most of the time I have a skeleton. There's the argument. There's a skeletal outline. I see how I'm going to get from point A to B to C. And then when I'm talking, like today, it's an exploration. It's not, here's what I think, it's right, and you should believe it. It's like, no, I'm trying to rectify my errors and extend what I know when I'm speaking and when I'm listening. And so I think that genuinely is what I'm doing. And I genuinely don't want to give people advice. It's something I've learned not least by being a psychotherapist. It's like, your destiny is not mine to mess with. I don't want to be responsible for your decisions. What if I'm wrong?
So that I actually think, you know, that's a very positively expressed epistemic humility and acknowledgement that he is riffing a lot of the time, just connecting things and seeing where they go. But the issue I would take is that comes at the end of the interview. And it reminds me of when Eric and Brett Weinstein issued at the end of their 2-hour episode where they basically allege all this misconduct by Carol Greeder, you know, targeting Brett. And then at the end they say, of course, we might be wrong and we don't, you know, everybody's memory is fallible and there's two sides to every story. But they don't display any of that humility throughout the episode, as we, you know, showed on the first episode we released. And the same applies here, that like there is very little of this epistemic humility throughout the preceding hours. So
exactly. That's my problem too, that throughout the whole thing, like there's no qualification There's no caveats. It's very vehement and as if you can't possibly disagree with this because it's just so logically forceful. Is the impression, even though, as we've talked about, it's usually not. So I really liked what you played there. That sounded great to me in and of itself. I remember that from the video. But yeah, as you say, it's not enough just to issue that disclaimer at the end, because it is like having your cake and eating it too, isn't it? Like it's like the conspiracy hypotheses.
And there's his position as a self-help guru. And I also find in this some segments where it's really clear why people would form such a personal attachment to him, because he comes across, and I don't think this is like feigned or insincere. I think he is somebody that gets emotionally invested and who is very, very personally involved in his philosophy, right? He really believes it. And there's this point where he talks about how he wants to help people. And I thought it was quite, I don't know the word, poignant or quite telling of his approach.
I truly want the best for what wants the best in you. Yeah.
Okay.
And people love that. They love that, man. If you're interacting with people with that ethos in mind, they find that, well, I think that's partly why people are responding so positively to my videos, because that ethos informs the videos. I'm saying I'm trying to figure out what's the best for us. Really, like the best.
Yeah, endearing. The final thing I'll say about on that theme is that I find that aspect of him where he is clearly thinking aloud and thinking as he's talking, and I think it's true. What he said about he's figuring stuff out. I mean, the downside of that is, of course, he's just riffing. He's like improvising all the way through, and that's a good reason. That's a prime reason why a lot of it doesn't make sense. But I. Just in terms of a subjective impression, I actually find it a little bit endearing, that willingness to think on your feet and sort of talk, think aloud. Yeah.
I sometimes use the same technique at lectures, right? So I'm not knocking someone for doing that, and he deserves credit for acknowledging it. I think it just sits uneasily with the level of certitude that he displays in other segments and in general throughout his material. He basically gives the impression, look, I thought about these things a lot, and my conclusions are not reached lightly. So treat them that way. But that might be true, but I'm not sure that he's done the requisite critical reflection on a bunch of the ideas which are now pretty crystalline.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean,
concrete.
It's a bit like that Mott and Bailey thing we talked about before, where he has it both ways. That's both. He means both the very forceful and concrete, specific thing, but also the very But you could also take it as the very nebulous, insubstantial thing. So he applies that to himself and his own material, and he said when he's actually presenting the ideas, it's absolute certainty. But it's also just speculation at the same time. So you can't really have it both ways, can you?
Yeah. It's he has an emotional investment in his audience and expresses it, right? And whenever we're talking about the techniques that people can use, it's not to infer that those techniques are used insincerely, but just that they do have a powerful effect on the audience. I think this is why people in part respond so defensively to him being criticized or whatever, because they feel that his heart is in the right place.
Yeah, it could well be. It's hard to know, isn't it? But I agree with you that he is passionate and feels very strongly, and I'm sure that's part of the appeal.
Well, he breaks down in tears in multiple times in his audiobook, right? And the thing is, when you're recording an audiobook, presumably it isn't live, right?
Yeah.
You could go back and edit that out, but he chose to leave in the edits where he's, in tears in multiple times. So I think the emotional displays, and I haven't watched like most of the content on his YouTube channel, but I gather that is something which happens. And I like, on the one hand, it's to his credit to show emotional fragility or, like expressiveness publicly, given that he's seen as this quite strident conservative figure. But on the other hand, it does feel a little bit potentially manipulative for parts of the audience.
Yeah, there's a charitable interpretation and a slightly less charitable interpretation, isn't there? I think we'll have to remain agnostic on that on that one.
Yeah. Just a point to note. So okay, let's return to something fun. All right, Matt. And so for something fun, we've kind of already discussed it a bit, but I think looking at the way that some of the material really comes across as almost indistinguishable from New Age kind of crystal fair stuff, it's hard to overstate how much that is the case. So I'm just going to play you a clip that might illustrate that.
If you contaminate the structure of your being with false information, with deceptive practices, and you willfully blind yourself, then you're going to be led astray by your sense of meaning. You're going to pathologize it. So part of the issue here is that you don't want to interfere with your ability to see, because you'll wander off the road into a ditch.
Okay. Yeah, well, those are some words.
Yeah. So how do you interpret that?
Yeah,
Matt?
it's almost like that New Age idea of you need to open your third eye in order to be guided along the correct path. Mm.
Yes, it is like that. So funny you should mention. Let's just listen to one more.
Because we're evolved for that. We can tell when it's happening, and that's what the sense of meaning is. The sense of meaning is it's our third eye, you could say. Your eyes blind you because they only see what's here right in front of you now. They blind you. And so you have to use modes of perception that transcend mere vision in order to conceptualize being properly. And one of those modes is the sense of meaning and engagement.
So the third eye, you do have to open your third eye.
You do indeed, I guess. Yeah. So, look, that is very Deepak Chopra-esque. He's definitely got a real interest in I have to call it the ineffable. Like we've talked about this earlier on, but he really has, much like a traditional New Age guru, he's very interested in these deep truths that are so profound that they can't be made explicit. So it's true mysticism or spiritualism, I suppose.
Yeah. And okay, so I promise this is the last one I'll play. But speaking to that, I actually have a clip which I call Deepak Peterson, and explicitly discusses mystics. So, okay, you can handle one more, right, Matt?
Yeah, bring it on.
We don't understand ourselves. That's obvious. We're more than we can understand. Yes, by a tremendous margin, and we're trying to understand ourselves. And the artists and the mystics are at the vanguard of the development of that understanding, and they come up with ideas that are clearer than mere feelings, but are not yet clear.
Clearer than mere feelings, but are not yet clear. Yeah. I mean, that's just one example out of many thousands, I think, during this talk.
It's to me, it feels like an over-reliance on metaphorical and mystical sounding language to imbue points that you want to make with a profundity, because there's charitable interpretations of what he's saying, which are like the human sense of meaning derives from the evolutionary history, which is deeper than any individual person and goes across generations. So focusing just on, your individual life doesn't tell you about how certain cognitive architecture evolved in humans or so on, right? There's ways that you can interpret this in a meaningful, coherent sense, but But that also applies in the case of like a lot of what New Age gurus are saying as well. There are interpretations of them which are less mystical and more metaphorical. Yeah. And he seems to jump back and forth depending on the argument as to whether he's being like an empirical scientist or whether he's actually talking about an ineffable metaphysical reality.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, for instance, he says that it's very difficult for us to understand ourselves, that we don't have the resources to truly understand ourselves. And, that's a aphorism, but it's true, right? It's true on a certain level. It's just that it's true in that kind of new agey superficial way, which is yes, but so what,
Yeah. And okay, so switching topics slightly, another example, a kind of clear example, which brings this out, this problem about the tension of metaphorical versus literal interpretations, comes when he gets pushed on the issue of the resurrection of Jesus and whether it is a real event or a metaphorical one. So maybe I'll start us off with a clip of him discussing this.
Did his body resurrect? I don't know. The accounts aren't clear, for one thing. What the accounts mean isn't clear. I don't know what happens to a person if they bring themselves completely into alignment. I've had intimations of what that might mean. We don't understand the world very well. We don't understand how the world could be mastered if it was mastered completely. We don't know how an individual might be able to manage that. We don't know what transformations that might make possible.
So did he bodily resurrect, Matt? He is saying that we don't know the world like we think we do. And, if you master meaning, what kind of transformations are
actually
possible?
It reminds me of you'd know more about this than me, Chris, but the Buddhist kind of ambiguity about sort of what happens when you truly achieve enlightenment. Like, I think there are some mystical interpretations which say that when a human being accomplishes that, then they kind of have supernatural powers, just like Jordan Peterson is heavily implying about, Christ having fully come completely into alignment and mastered meaning, and therefore be able to accomplish things like coming back from the dead. Am I right in thinking that's a bit of a Buddhist thing as well?
Yeah, Buddha, like a lot of religious traditions, and Buddhism is no exception, going along the path to enlightenment includes the development of supernatural powers in classical texts. And there's also various traditions, like the Theravada tradition typically does acknowledge that the Buddha was a human who reached enlightenment and entered nirvana. But the later I'm getting into like Buddhist sectarian disputes, but the Mahayana traditions, which are possibly later, but at least are a splinter sect, they instead saw the Buddha as a being that was putting on the display of being a human, but was actually already enlightened. And like, so there's many layers in these traditions, right? It's not just Christianity, which has this ambiguity.
Yeah, but that's the point, isn't it? That at this sort of abstract level that Jordan Peterson is speaking to, it's a kind of a theme which you see in New Age stuff, in Buddhist stuff, and in this kind of transcendental Christian stuff as well.
Yeah, and in the interview, Jordan Levine pushes him by saying, right, but fundamentalists or Christians want to know, this metaphorical discussion is all well and good, but like, do you literally believe that Christ was reborn and that he rose from the dead? So let's hear him grapple a bit more with that question.
Is his resurrection real? Well, his spirit lives on. That's certainly the case.
In what sense do you mean spirit, just to qualify that?
Well, let's imagine that a spirit is a pattern of being. And we know that patterns can exist patterns can be transmitted across multiple substrates, right? Vinyl, electronic impulses, air, vibrations in your ear, neurological patterns, dance. It's all the translation of what you might describe as a spirit, right? It's that pattern. It's independent of its material substrate. Well, Christ's spirit lives on. It's had a massive effect across time.
I'll jump in because that's returning to the kind of thing that really annoys me as someone who gets grumpy with poor argumentation, because he's asked specifically about whether Christ literally resurrected, and then he redefines living on in terms of the spirit living on in terms of any kind of transcribed substrates and patterns of writing or dance or whatever, and says that's the spirit, and therefore, avoids the direct question and instead redefines the word lives on to be such a broad general thing that the answer is kind of meaningless. So anyway, I'll go, that triggered me. Sorry, Chris.
No, that's all right. And I mean, I think spending a couple, 10 seconds or so to list the different patterns of vibrations that exist might be somewhat deflection from the main question. And in that case, in essence, he's essentially endorsing a metaphorical interpretation, right? Well, his influence exists in the world, and like by spirit, I mean the vibration of his teachings. But there's another part. So this section goes on for quite a while, and this is him talking a bit more, I think maybe arguing against that a little bit. So let's see.
Is there something more than merely metaphorical about the idea of dying and being reborn? Yes, there is, because those are associated with physiological transformations. What's the ultimate extent of that? That's a good question. The question is, what happens to the world around you as you increasingly embody the logos? And the answer to that is, we don't know.
So I'm just going to say that wasn't the question, right? The question has been redefined there, and again, it's like the slipping in and out of endorsing a kind of magical, literal, physical resurrection, or at least dancing very, very close to that, and then like slipping immediately back to metaphorical mastery or transformation and like the different meanings that can attend to. But at the very beginning, he acknowledges, is it something more than a metaphor? Is it a physical thing? Yes. But by the end, he's back to talking about something which sounds fairly metaphorical or conceptual.
I mean, there's a pattern I've noticed. It just occurred to me just now, which is that when he's being slippery and avoiding giving a direct answer, that's when he tends to use those turns of phrase that he's well known for. Like those things like, that's a good question, or, that's very complicated, actually. That's much more complicated, or we don't know, So like I see that he uses those a lot.
Yeah, I really like like might be a strong word, but I get enjoyment from the fact that he so often engages in Socratic dialogues with himself. Yeah. where it leads to like him often saying, somebody presenting a point, and then so it's like, no, you're wrong, man. And, he has an interviewer there, but he still uses these little internal dialogues, and I think to some extent that's reflective of his mind, that he's constantly kind of battling back and forth. And in fairness, he is usually falling on one side in those arguments. So it's kind of a rhetorical technique, but like you say, it comes out more on certain subjects than on others.
And I have to say though, I kind of like, just objectively, I enjoy it, like it's quite engaging and a little bit, I said it before, endearing, those rhetorical patterns that he employs. It's like when I actually pay attention like I am now, I go, hang on, you're using this to actually avoid saying anything concrete. But when I just listen to it casually, I think those mannerisms are part of the appeal.
So it's like some people will say it's a technique, but it's like, no, it's not.
No, it's more complicated than that, Chris. It's very complicated.
Yeah, it's more complicated. Yeah. I think you can both enjoy it and appreciate the like rhetorical value that it lends his arguments. Both things are possible, Matt. But you can have both the best of both worlds.
I can hold both those ideas in a state of sort of quantum superposition, Chris. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it is exactly what I was saying, Matt. And okay, and this point about the discussion about the resurrection and stuff, and this talk is about religion, which means that it features quite a lot. But the extent to which he is interested in theology and Christianity, it can't be overestimated. And it leads me to this point I want to discuss, where he's strongly emphasizing throughout many of the segments the unique aspect of Christianity, and that he ties this in, like, Christianity and to a large extent the West are seen as fundamentally connected. Okay, so let me play a clip that might highlight the kind of thing I'm talking about.
The Western imagination has been at work for a very long time constructing up a meta hero and also his adversary and clarifying the nature of those. And that has been done in a sufficiently delineated way so that it's produced a major impact on the manner in which our societies are constructed, because the cornerstone of our society is respect for logos, and that's instantiated in the doctrine of respect for free speech. That it's also instantiated in the doctrine that every individual has transcendent value, which I do believe is something that the West has developed to a far greater degree than any other culture that currently exists and probably ever existed.
That's a good example of the ability to jump from one topic to the next and connect them all together. He's going from Christ as a meta hero to him being an instantiation of the fundamental force of logos, and that being the basis for free speech, and also connected to the development of human rights, which reached their epitome in Western civilization. And he's good at that, at putting it all together in a narrative. But I think that the degree to which he focuses on the Western and Christian having these exceptional qualities, to me, it's an example of availability heuristic, where he knows these traditions well, and he's able to, draw connections and link examples to it. And it isn't like Christianity is not connected to the development of the West, but like we've talked about earlier, the notion that respect for individuals is a feature only, or like epitomized most in the West. I don't know. Do you find it convincing?
Well, as you said, he links together. He's very good. He links together about 7 different ideas into a narrative, but each one of those connections is debatable. As always, there's a charitable interpretation, which, as you said, obviously Christianity was an important influence in the West. Cultural changes happened post-Christianity as compared to pre-Christianity in the West, although it can be hard to separate it from all kinds of other historical developments that went on, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, as you said, it's partly the availability heuristic. Look, so putting aside the quality of his argument, which is not great, but it's a very short argument where he's putting together so many things that could never be that good. I think the interesting thing to note is that he is a Western exceptionalist. He does believe that there's something very special and unique in the West, in capital letters, and he attributes that to Christianity, which I personally don't buy. I think there are things that are distinct, but
what about the emphasis on the individual? Because when he's talking about respect for truth and meta heroes, I can't help but think of there's right speech in the Buddhist tradition, and you can find plenty of exhortations that the individual has to master themselves, or that mastering the passions of the mind and so on. I think that there are concepts in other traditions. If you look, and it doesn't mean that they're all equally distributed, but this notion that it's Christianity that led to the development of individualism in the West. I know that there's mainstream scholars who make this point too, right? Like Joe Henrich is probably the most recent, arguing that the weird psychology, so-called weird psychology that we see in Western societies, which include a focus on individualism, he traces it to the ban of cousin marriages in the Western Catholic Church. And this is a book that's just come out and articles that were published in Nature, which caused some controversy. But I mention that to say that he's not the only one drawing connections, and there are mainstream scholars who argued for these kind of things as well. But I don't know. I'm not expressing it well, but I just find that there's a kind of tautological quality to the arguments, because it's looking at the, what happened in history and what came before, and saying, well, that had to cause that and be the basis for that. But the historical dice only gets rolled once. So if it was a Buddhist civilization who had developed gunpowder to a greater extent, it was like Buddhist civilizations that I think discovered it. But if they had dominated for various different reasons, maybe we would have a human rights system that is less about the divinity of individual people and being recreated in Christ's image, and more about like respect for all beings and sentient life.
Yeah, of course. And, Buddhism has got that very important tradition of focusing on, internal individual enlightenment rather than, as a thing to strive for, which is, obviously an individual focus. Look, I think what you're saying is obviously true, which is that, in short, I don't know to what degree individualism is a distinctive characteristic of Western culture as compared to other cultures. I know there's a lot of research on individualistic versus collectivist cultures and so on, but there's a real danger to looking at history with the motivation of finding a single dramatic sweep. History is extremely complicated, and isolating the causal factors is hard. So I'm sure there are historians who argue it both ways in terms of the degree to which Christianity inculcated a greater sense of individual rights or individual freedoms or whatever in European countries. So I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I guess my broader argument is that a whole bunch of the stuff that he presents is arguments which are already known and which fall broadly within the category of Western exceptionalism or Christian apologetics. And there's a well-known argument for the division between science and religion called non-overlapping magisteria by Stephen Jay Gould, which argues that science deals with the material and the real world, and religion is more to do with the spiritual realities and metaphors and doesn't encroach on that. And there's a point where Jordan Peterson essentially makes the exact same argument.
And some of it's also philosophical confusion, in my estimation. It's like once the rationalists and the empiricists got going, we started to formulate a very powerful doctrine of the objective world, and that doctrine appeared to stand in opposition to the doctrine that was put forth by the Christian church, the mythological doctrine, let's say, if you assume that what the mythological doctrine was a variant of that kind of empirical truth, which it wasn't.
Yeah, I mentioned that to point out that it's carving out this realm for religion where it's metaphorical and mythological, and it doesn't encroach on the empirical sciences, and those are different domains. But then, as we see later, as we've seen, with the resurrection discussion, there is empirical claims, and there are encroachments on scientific topics and debates that impact actual, like creationism and intelligent design are the clearest examples, but there's plenty of others, and it simply isn't the case that the majority of the world treat all their religious ideas as metaphorical, mythological beliefs.
And look, and furthermore, Jordan Peterson doesn't either, because earlier on he he talked about how that theological level had to be influencing evolution. So we have to take that into account. You can't ignore that. The materialists can't, you can't be a materialist and evolutionary biologist, was his argument. And yeah, as you say, pretty much all of the religions did make or do make strong materialist claims about literally creating the creation of man, for instance, mankind, or humankind, I should say, and that's only made kind of abstracted once the evidence against that just mounted up and it became an untenable position for an educated person to have. So JBP seems to be an apologist, as you say, because he's working hard he'll sometimes rely on that non-overlapping magisterial idea to carve out this distinct realm for theology, but he'll sometimes rely on that levels of reality idea where he puts theology down there at the most fundamental level of reality, and the material stuff being kind of ephemera that sits on top of that.
Yeah. So I guess we've banged the drum of his contradictions and his Christian-centric obsession. I might put it, or if you want to be nicer, you could say
deep fascination.
Chris. Yeah, his deep fascination with Christianity. We've banged that drum hard enough. So maybe for the last point, so we don't end up with like a 4-hour podcast, it's worth turning to some of the more grounded issues and some of the stuff that probably has made him a more controversial figure, which only really gets touched on at the end of this interview. And this is his connections or his ideas being taken up or co-opted by the far-right or alt-right communities, and the issues that he has with the left and the far left. So let's get started I'll play a clip with him talking about the left and what the issue is with them.
I don't believe that what I've been discussing has been co-opted to any significant degree. I think that what has happened is that at this time and place, for some reason, it isn't the people on the left who are particularly open to the message, but that's because I think that they're far more gripped by the totalitarian spirit than people aligned along the rest of the spectrum.
Right, so that's him pushing back on the suggestion, that his message has been co-opted, and he thinks that's been exaggerated by various commentators. But you can also hear there that he's basically saying for him that in the modern era, the totalitarians that he sees around him, which are concerning, are the left, and it's not so evident that it's a problem on the other ends of the spectrum.
Yeah. So it's pretty hard to say, look at a left political leader like Joe Biden and have any serious concerns about totalitarianism, isn't it?
Yeah, I think this is a perennial issue, that there's the concern about the far left woke vanguard and their influence, but a lot of it comes down to them being presented as the secret powers behind the moderates, like Clinton or Biden, that they're just the figureheads for the actual powers who are in American politics, at least. In British politics, you had Corbyn, who was, well, at this time probably was the leader of the Labour Party, but he didn't get elected. And now Labour again has a moderate leader in Keir Starmer. So there's this notion that the totalitarian ideology of the kind of woke left will lead to a new Maoist regime, but there's a distinct lack of concern, and this is part of what has got him in trouble with the existing far-right regimes, several of which are in actual power, and this is instantiated in his visit to Orban in Hungary, who is residing over an actual regime which is rolling back freedoms and, curtailing the press, closing down universities. But he was able to go there and have, a friendly chat with him about the importance of Christianity in Western civilization.
Yeah, so if you wanted to concede for the sake of argument that there was let's say, some concerning authoritarian tendencies on the extreme end of the left. If one conceded that.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Okay, so I think what you're saying is if one concedes that, sure, but a complete myopic obsession with just that and a complete obliviousness to the very widespread and large-scale tendency towards authoritarianism on the right is not a sensible position.
Yeah, and it leads people to question essentially where Peterson characterizes himself as non-political. It doesn't come across like that whenever you're kind of downplaying the extremism that exists on the right and elevating that which exists on the left. That comes across as partisan politics. And this is a clip of him talking about why he sees the left as the greater issue in the modern world.
The campuses have not been infiltrated by right-wing radicals. Not at all. Right. Not in the least.
The campuses.
Yeah. Well, the problem with that is that's where the campuses, the humanities, let's lay it out again. Theology at the bottom, philosophy after that. Well, that's where the humanities are. The humanities are nearest to the foundation of our culture. And they're completely dominated by radical leftists, postmodern neo-Marxists. It's not, and that's not my opinion. That's well documented. Right. Like, there aren't even conservatives in those domains, let alone right-wingers.
I mean, that shows, kind of following in the footsteps of James Lindsay last week, that his concern is really with the influence of the left and the radical left on education, and that he sees, postmodern neo-Marxist philosophy as infecting society from academia outwards and from culture outwards, and that is what justifies his unrelenting focus on that topic. And what do you think?
Well, I think there's a sense in which he's right and a sense in which he's wrong. So I guess the sense in which he's right is when you look at surveys of academics, then yes, we are generally strongly on the progressive side of politics. That's true. So it's fair to say that left-wing ideas have a command in the academy that right-wing ideas don't. And okay, so I'm trying to make concessions. So the other thing that's fair to say is that that political slant is evident in many ideas that come out of academia and are influential in society. So the people who go to university and get degrees, especially fancy universities, are the people who end up running companies and being in managerial, administrative, and political positions, and so on. So that's the sense, I guess, in which he's right. I guess the sense in which he's wrong is that that's not a reason to completely ignore. The society and politics is bigger than just the academy. And it's true that the right-wing populists tend to have the greatest amount of popularity with people who don't go to university or don't have the highest levels of education. That doesn't make them any less concerning.
And don't you think there's this element about this, which is people are complaining about the left-wing elitists in academia and their ironclad grip over society and how we need to counteract their harmful ideologies being spread. But it all rests on the notion that it's these quite academic ideas and the way that they're instantiated in activist movements, which are the most important thing in the modern world and in politics. And it strikes me as a thing that conservative academics or just intellectuals would inevitably find more intuitively appealing, that it's about these philosophies and ideas and debating them. And it's not just about political rhetoric and emotional appeals or the rise of like xenophobia or these kind of things. It is more about these quite rarefied philosophical approaches, and that's what we need to talk about, focus, understand, and those are the big threats in the modern world.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think when you're sort of an armchair opinionator and as someone who reads and writes for a living, or like Jordan Peterson, you work in a university, then the stuff you see is the kind of more rarefied stuff. But the stuff that's on TV and the stuff that's actually relevant to most people is not the same stuff. So you get
like The Apprentice.
Exactly. Like it's not popular culture. Yes, it does feed in, but even then the degree to which it's actually causal is debatable. There might be some sort of ready-made buzzwords that apply, but I'm not sure that the arrow of causality is completely in that one direction.
No, and I think it's important to remember that this interview is taking place in the context of the first year of Trump's presidency, and Boris Johnson is, I think at this time, the leader of, if not, it's Theresa May. But and Brexit has been, in the wheels are moving. So this is not an era in which the left are politically dominating the landscape.
That's right, because people who don't have PhDs get to vote too. So, and the other thing where I think he's wrong is that we've talked about this before, but he, like a lot of these figures, they characterize academia as total, and the social sciences as totally in the grip of cultural Marxists or whoever. And, we don't need to labor this point, but it's just not, it's not, psychologists are social scientists, and psychology is not like that. It really isn't.
Yeah, there's a very weird comment he makes round about the end where he says something like conservatives can be labeled right wing, and he basically suggests that that's invalid.
There's not even any conservatives. I mean, maybe you can call conservatives right wing. I think you gotta, you're pushing your luck when you do that.
I was just listening to it going, well, who is right wing if conservatives aren't? So like there seems to be at least some confusion about the relative proportions of people and the political spectrum. Because like I think conservatives are right wing. Like that's a fairly uncontroversial thing to say.
Yeah. Agreed.
All right. Well, so we're probably like on the 8th hour now. So maybe we should bring it to a close with our concluding thoughts. So since I enjoy putting you on the spot and forcing you to do this first, so Matt, how would you summarize all of this and all of the preceding discussion in a pithy, short
I've told you before,
sentences?
I hate these takeaways. My instinct is to say a lot. Okay. So look, we've covered all of this, so I'm not going to reiterate it, but this is largely about a mystical Christian view of the world. He's pretty explicit about that. He makes a lot of specific arguments, and as we covered, when you actually look at the argumentation that he provides, it's extremely hand-wavy, and the connections he makes between ideas are very tenuous, which is fine if you're not looking for that kind of argument. But I think we just need to be aware that he's not actually providing evidence or a logical justification for what he's saying. He's stringing together a series of associations to paint a kind of poem, a narrative of life and the world, which he sees as meaningful. And, I think that's a large part of the appeal. I think people seem to feel in deficit of meaning, and they really appreciate the kind of things that JBP offers, which is the same things that religion and New Age gurus offer, which is that sense of wonder, that sense of being in touch with the ineffable, and the sense that the mundane events in one's life, like cleaning one's room, is connected to some sense of higher purpose. So I appreciate the reasons for the appeal, and indeed in JBP's interest in this stuff himself. He strikes me as someone who is very much, he's genuinely consumed with these issues, and is, talking to himself as much as to anyone else. So what else to say? I don't like this kind of thing, partly because I'm an atheist, so it's not going to work for me. Also partly because I have to read a lot of student essays, and when people string together bad arguments, not to say they're wrong, just if they're not tightly argued, then my instinct is to get out the red pen and correct them. So it doesn't work for me on multiple levels. And I think that's all I can think of to say right now. How about you, Chris?
Well, so thinking of Jordan Peterson as a guru, the impression that I get is that a large part of his appeal is the willingness to build these grand narratives that range across different disciplines and reference, classical literature and mythology and biblical stories and a whole bunch of things, and pull them together into this narrative. And I think maybe I differ a little bit from you in that I think he does have arguments for the linkages that he's fleshed out in quite a lot of detail in some of his other content, and even to some extent here. But I agree with you that a lot of it comes down to hand-wavy associations and things that fall apart the more that you dig into them. But in the same way as people like Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs and Steel, or even Richard Dawkins, people offering these grand, sweeping messages that help you understand society and help you understand yourself have a lot of appeal. And his characteristic as the guru who knows, has a mastery of so many topics and is also emotionally available to his followers and cares deeply about them. It's all classical guru stuff, and the fact that it's tied up with a Christian and psychological bow just leads to it having a intrinsic appeal, which I don't find it that surprising that he was able to become so popular. And listening to his 12 rules for life, if you let it all wash over you and you don't think too hard about it, it's kind of an enjoyable thing. So yeah, I guess my point is just that I see him as an almost prototypical guru and one who fits neatly into this modern age by, providing online lectures, getting involved with culture war commentary on Twitter. And maybe a point to end on is that it looks like his tale will be quite a tragic one because he ended up addicted to painkillers, in part because of the fame and the schedule, it seems likely. And then in efforts to get off those, seems to have suffered brain damage as part of an induced coma and may never return to the public stage. So whether you see that as a good or a bad thing depends on your view on the man, but it's certainly the case that there's a tragic arc to his story where there's a meteoric rise, like a controversy-fueled period where he's at his peak, and then a dramatic and sudden collapse. So maybe he'll be a figure that people are still talking about in 10 or 20 years, or he'll just be a minor cultural footnote. I can't predict.
Yeah, look, I completely agree with you about Jordan Peterson being the prototypical guru that we're interested in. And it's surprising that he's not recognized as a New Age meaning giver in the same mold as Deepak Chopra, because it is so similar in terms of the nature of the appeal and the style of presentation. It's interesting that it's simply because he's a Christian as opposed to being into some Eastern religion of some kind. It seems that people don't think that he could possibly be a New Age guru in that case. And the other interesting thing about him is that he does combine the mysticism with, a smattering of scientific evidence as well, although somewhat haphazardly. Although even that is not entirely remarkable for a New Age guru. Of course, we've got quantum consciousness and ideas like that came out of your more traditional New Age gurus. They don't do it as well as Jordan Peterson, but there's certainly a long tradition of wanting to incorporate the legitimacy of science into their worldview. So, as I said at the beginning, he's the big kahuna. He is the man. He is just a wonderful example of what we're interested in. And I I feel pretty sanguine, I suppose, about Jordan Peterson. I feel sympathetic because it does look like his arc has ended. I think that the people who, or at least the vast majority of people who get something from Jordan Peterson, I think it's probably almost entirely benign, in that they really are just looking for a bit of help in terms of their lives and just looking for a bit of meaning. I think they could get that stuff from other sources, or they can get it from JBP. In terms of the political stuff, I could completely understand why more progressive people would have a big problem with Jordan Peterson, because I think he, like a lot of the IDW figures, have that myopic obsession with the excesses of the left and completely give a pass to anything right of center. So I think that's pretty much it.
All right. Yeah, agreed. So we're always good at this, but the last couple of things that we should mention is we have a Twitter account, which is Guru's Pod.
Yes.
Yeah, it is. And then we have an email account, which is decodingthegurus@gmail.com. So you can send back any feedback there or tweet at us on Twitter, where I'm at C_Kavanagh and Matt
Arthur C.
is Arthur C.
You can also leave us a 5-star review on the iTunes store. There's no other. Don't try to give us a 4-star review or a 3-star review. It'll actually break your browser. So just only. Yeah,
these things. I didn't realize. Podcasts are always asking for those, but I didn't realize they're actually like gold dust to get people to write a review. Apparently, it's a very rare thing. So yeah, do that. And even if you want to write something mean, that's okay. That's all right. We can take it.
No, Chris, no.
Is that the wrong message? Well, yeah.
All right.
We don't. Next week, do we know who we're dealing with?
We don't know yet, but we will announce it very soon. So yeah, this was fun. I think this is my favorite episode ever. Thanks, Chris.
All right. Same to you. Bye-bye.
See ya.